Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss lessons from pandemic kids' return to school. But first, I recently spoke with Hana Shepherd, Associate Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University, about her recent paper titled Administering New Anti-Bullying Law: The Organizational Field and Schooled Variation During Initial Implementation. The paper is to be published in Law and Social Inquiry and is co-authored by Idit Fast. Professor Shepherd, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, your paper identifies that there's this law that's been passed on harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And your paper is investigating this complex process of how it was implemented at the school site. But just to get started, what did the law require? If that's not, maybe that itself is contested, but as your best read, what did the law require?
Yeah, so it was a complicated sort of set of requirements. Some of the requirements were quite straightforward. For example, identifying someone, usually a counselor in the school, who would serve as what was called the harassment, intimidation, bullying specialist. So that's sort of a procedural aspect. The law also required districts to adopt anti-bullying policies. So that was also kind of procedural. So there was a number of things like in that category. And then what this paper mostly focused on, and what the schools and the districts, I think, had the most trouble with, were actually, when it gets down to it, should an event that a kid reports as bullying be investigated as bullying under the new requirements, and B, what are the precise criteria that the school officials use to determine whether an event was or was not bullying. And so the part of the concern about sort of putting a formal investigation in is that the law also required a lot of additional paperwork. So it was a lot of documentation. I should have said also the law required schools to take proactive steps to sort of improve school climate, like implementing programs. So it was there was a lot of things going on, and the requirements, I think you could sort of, put on a scale in terms of how hard they were for schools to implement, either because they took a lot of time and energy, or because they were just how straightforward or ambiguous they were to actually put into place, even if there was adequate time and energy to do them.
So on it sounds like correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like the ambiguous ones were or time energy ones, or some mixture thereof, was where the questions or challenges arose.
Exactly. So in the paper, we identified two places where schools varied the most from each other, and sort of reported the most difficulty in implementing the law. And the first was in sort of, do I initiate a formal investigation that requires all this documentation and gets formally reported to the state? And I think that was largely, in the domain of this takes a lot of time, especially given that they're often the school counselors who are involved in doing this. So it took time away from their other important work with the students. So that was the first. And then the second was this question of how do I interpret what happened between these students, right? This kind of the social interactions between kids are quite complicated, often nuanced. How do I interpret that in a way that I can understand it as a HIB, a harassment, intimidation, bullying event, or not? So that was in the ambiguity sort of category.
So when you went into this school, you walked in with some prior research that's been done, and theories people have.
how might analysts have expected schools to respond to this new law if they just had in their, as a resource to use for interpretation, particular perspectives from prior to your work?
Yeah, I think there was a couple things that stood out to us as researchers. One of the things that I think we had which was really nice from an analytical standpoint, is that we were actually going into 56 schools. So this project was part of helping schools figure out how to address their school climate. So we got to see like a very wide range of schools. So one of the things that I think was particularly obvious and stood out was just how different the schools were in terms of what they were doing to implement the law. And I think a lot of the existing work on how organizations implement law really focuses on the way that sort of different kinds of factors produce conformity or produce more similarity in how organizations implement law. So this is particularly on like equal employment opportunity law that emphasizes a lot about how organizational attempts to implement those kind of procedures end up looking more similar to each other. So that was the first kind of most obvious thing that we went in with. So then the question was, given that a lot of the existing work that analysts have, perspectives analysts have advanced emphasize conformity, then how do we understand the sort of span of variation? Another kind of interesting point is that previous scholars have emphasized how organizations that are more in the public eye, like schools, obviously, some of the most, schools are one of the places where people direct a lot of their attention, that those places are more likely to comply more narrowly with law because they're getting lots of attention. And they're worried about, getting sued. So that was also something that I think was really noticeable going in, was that these schools weren't necessarily defaulting to the most kind of stringent way of implementing the law out of fear of, social attention or, lawsuits. That wasn't happening. And so then we're trying to figure out how did we understand that difference from what had previously been reported?
Well, maybe you can say a little bit more about the differences that you observed. When you talked about those two different dimensions of, I guess, what kind of follow-up to do and what criteria or how do we interpret this particular event between students? So, those sound like they're kind of the that's where the policy really is expecting to, ultimately that's where it would go. So but there apparently was variation in schools. What kinds of variations, what kinds of things did you see?
Yeah, right. So we have these two dimensions, whether sort of the criteria that school officials used to decide whether they were going to do a full investigation into a reported bullying event. And then the other was, what criteria were they using for deciding whether an event counted as bullying or not? So on the first dimension, the variation was either schools followed the letter of the law, which was that they should investigate every single report of bullying. So that was one option. Again, like that required a lot of resources. Reports could come from kids, they could come from teachers, they could come from parents, right? So there's a lot of potential sources for these kinds of reports. So that was one option. other option was that schools decided they would do some like preliminary investigation into a report before deciding whether they do the full formal report and do all the required paperwork. And then the third option for investigations was that some schools decided that they would investigate immediately if the report was coming from a parent, but do like a preliminary investigation if the report was coming from a student. And so they were trying to calibrate then basically, right? Like where should we, direct our energy based on, the source of the report. And one thing that I think any school administrator would tell you is that students, use the word bullying, got very savvy, right? About like, they knew if they used any of these kind of harassment, intimidation, bullying sort of trigger words, that it would get a certain kind of attention. So schools were trying to figure out how to match resources with that reality. So that was the first variation on that first dimension of investigations. And then the second dimension of like, what criteria do you use? Like, some of the examples we provide are quite, they like seem funny, right? But it's like when the school is in the process, the officials are in the process trying to sort out like, what is this thing that happened? What is the nature of this social interaction that happened between these students? And are we going to say that it meets some really high level of a violation? It's tricky. It's really tricky, and it's really, I think, very, very stressful for a lot of the school officials. So there was there was two dimensions for the criteria. One is whether they followed the kind of a small set of what they called targeted characteristics that were set out in the law. And basically these are like kind of traditionally, in civil rights law, characteristics that are distinguishing. And if, a bullying event involved those characteristics, gender, race, nativity, status, those kind of things, that they were considered it was considered to be a HIB event. So some schools sort of hone very closely to those characteristics, while other schools used a much broader, brought their own interpretations and characteristics into the process of deciding whether an event actually qualified as HIB or not. I should also say, one of the things I forgot to say about like what the law did was it actually made it possible to hold school officials legally liable for their participation in bullying. So all of this kind of, the law ratcheted up the pressure on everyone about being responsible for what happened between students.
So you mean they could be sued as an individual, not just as a member, not the school district? The school district could be sued, I'm sure, but the person themselves could be financially liable.
Yeah.
So then but the question is why, I'm wondering, when I actually look back into film, movies and such, bullying doesn't happen. It does happen on all those things that you identify, but it happens on all sorts of other things. Somebody's wearing glasses, so we're going to pick on them.
Yes.
And then the other, somebody needs glasses and then decides not to wear them because they don't want to. So they take their glasses off as soon as they get out away from the home, so parents can't see them. Right. And then they're struggling in school. So, or, you're playing this instrument and you're lugging around this big instrument. So I'm wondering why, I don't know if you know anything about the legislative history, but why was, this vast domain of potential reasons, which is basically infinite, that somebody gets picked on, reduced down to things that some adults, we all know those things are important, but they're not it's not an exclusive set of things that people. So I'm just wondering, what was the logic? Why did that happen? Or And then I guess the next question is how it's, how did people respond to it in the school site? Was there pushback on it?
Yeah, totally. Those are great questions. I didn't do like a full excavation of the process leading up to the implementation of the law. So I can't say for sure, but my sense is that basically, the lawmakers adopted, well, so the law was actually passed also, it was part of a whole, kind of move at the state level to pass anti-bullying laws, that occurred in the early 2000s and through 2010s. So, for that period, I forget the exact numbers, but the number of states that had anti-bullying laws went from a handful to almost all. So it was really like a moment, a social moment. In particular, there was a couple of very high-profile cases, one of whom a freshman at Rutgers, Tyler Clemente, who committed suicide after sort of, LGBT-related harassment from his, or the story was from his roommate. So my sense is that, that when lawmakers anchor on a couple of high-profile events, the sort of the causes or the kind of perceived motivations for those events get more time and more space in sort of the construction of the legislation. But also, I think more importantly, as one of the school administrators that we interviewed said, the roots of the law were as a civil rights law. So it was basically kind of borrowing the categories from civil rights law in order to make sure that students with marginalized identities were particularly protected. But as you pointed out, like the thing that is so tricky about bullying is that and we know this from the history of trying to implement civil rights law, is that often people don't, make clear that the targeted characteristic is the basis on which they are discriminating. So that kind of action often escapes, formal punishment. But also, right, like there's the social dynamics of bullying are such that what really matters is relative status of students in schools, and sometimes those relative status maps on to these characteristics that are enshrined in both civil rights law and in this bullying law, and a lot of times they don't. So it's sort of, I think, right, like trying to formalize and provide criteria for something that is so complicated and so specific to whatever is happening within the school, and so specific to kind of how students are arranged in hierarchies within a school. So so there's a lot there, obviously, about and I'm sure someone else could give more like specific insight about what exactly happened in the case of New Jersey. But as to the second part of your question, that how did the schools respond? I think this is part of why there was just such a variation in responses, because some really kind of said, okay, well, this is what the law says, we're going to use these criteria, and then a lot of them said this doesn't map on to how bullying is, and so that was really kind of the source for all sorts of different paths that schools took.
It just strikes me as there's no real reason. I'm struggling to figure out what would be the reason to say a criterion. I can understand saying a criterion to identifying particular criteria for what would count as bullying or intimidation or harassment, like, you could say it's got to be damaging or something. But I don't understand why you would need to say a particular set of dimensions along which it must run. It just doesn't seem necessary to even ask that question. So I'm just, but I think that's helpful what you're saying about that it's coming out of a tradition, and that's the kind of, in another context that probably makes a lot of sense, but in this context, but so when you say there's pushback, so, and also there's this variation in the schools in what they do. Were non-school actors like parents or lawyers or consultants, did they engage this at all, or were they kind of passive observers of this burgeoning diversity of responses? I mean, how, to the extent you can say, what did you pick up on their engagement or lack thereof?
Yeah, I would say, I think what was so notable and sort of helps us understand what the schools were grappling with was that basically everyone got involved, right? Like the parents were involved. They were saying, this is bullying, this isn't bullying. They're reporting things that happened online to the schools, right? So they were all in the mix. The state Department of Education was doing lots and lots of work to train schools, train districts in the law. They knew it was, a complicated law. There were some, at the beginning, lawsuits against the state for claiming that this was an unfunded mandate. This law constituted an unfunded mandate because it required schools to do so much more work. There was, at the district level, the superintendents were trying to figure out, how do we implement this in our district? They had their legal team giving advice to specific school, to the counselor, to the vice principal. And then there was like, this whole ecosystem of companies that, sell their services to write policy for a school district, and they pivoted to, do these trainings. So I think one of the things that was really notable was just the school personnel telling us, like, we're getting this message from this source and this message from this source, and they're just getting sort of lots and lots of messaging about, both like, questioning the legitimacy or not of the law, but then also sort of trying to say, this is how you should actually implement the law. And I think that was the backdrop against they were trying to balance, what can we actually do within our schools, but then also here's all this legal and non-legal advice that they're getting about implementation. So yeah, everyone got in the mix. I think it seemed like what happened right away.
So do you think that this case, when I say case, the case of this law and its implementation, you had 56 schools, so you're seeing all sorts of different things. What does it modify how we should think about how law can be used, or what are the constraints or possibilities of the use of law to get organizations aligned with behaviors that we prefer? Or this may not be the best form question, but I'm just trying to figure out what do we take? There's what we learn about this specific case, but that case is, past. But there's going to be one tomorrow, or there might be a revision of this particular law. So what can we learn about how to think about, or ways we might think about, how law operates when a new regulation or law gets passed, and institutions, especially schools, have to engage it?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really important question. The scholars who have been working on this question of how organizations implement law for a long time have really highlighted how much, like, in the absence of really clear guidance about exactly what to do and exactly how to implement something, organizations will make up, what they should do. So there's a lot of kind of like creative, work within organizations to often, as Lauren Edelman talks about, symbolically comply as opposed to substantively comply. So I think one of the clear lessons, both from that work and here, is that, in any law, there is sort of a set of things that are quite straightforward. It was clear the schools needed to identify someone to be a HIB specialist, and they could do that. And then there's a set of things where the law was quite ambiguous, and it was around that ambiguity that organizations don't know what to do. So there's something about, as laws are getting written, being able to identify ahead of time which of these things are going to be, if we know that social life is extremely complicated and it is almost, sometimes impossible to write. I mean, the ideal is that any law will be less ambiguous. So that's the first ideal. And then second, acknowledging that it's extremely difficult to write law that takes into account the span of, complexity of social life. I think being able to identify which are these aspects of law that are going to be easiest to implement and which are the aspects of law that are not going to be easiest to implement. And really I think one of the things that was so hard for schools was that all of these external actors, the parents, the private companies, the lawyers for the district, they weren't on the same page about those aspects of the ambiguous law that schools had to figure out a way to actually put into place. So I think a couple of the lessons are, not like in this case, like a free marketplace of ideas for how to interpret the law was not helpful. So figuring out, once laws are implemented, how do you get the key actors on the same page about what to do? So that's one thing. I think the most important thing, though, is acknowledging that law is always going to be sort of the implementation is always going to depend on local conditions. So what can this school do? What are the substantive goals? And how do you match what the school can do in terms of what its resources are, what the kind of problems they see, with the real substantive goals, which are that all kids have a good educational experience and that they feel safe and they feel like they can learn. And so I think obviously that takes a lot more work than just listing out here the criteria on which you make a decision about whether an event is HIB or not. But I think allowing for more space and more kind of training that acknowledges, that's really tailored to what is going on in a school specifically, or any kind of organization specifically, and allowing that to be part of the implementation process seems like one kind of lesson.
Well, Professor Shepherd, when I read your paper, it was, I sort of operate just sort of, like probably many people, just assuming, oh, well, the law is this, the law is that. And I was, it was an intervention in my understanding, see the massive amount of differences in the way people talked about it. It's an incredibly rich paper with a lot of insightful and illuminating detail. I appreciate your doing this work, and I appreciate your coming on and sharing it with us today.
Thank you so much for asking me. I love talking about it, obviously.
Our final segment concerns teachers' encounters with students as children return to school or enter school for the first time. The Washington Post interviewed kindergarten through 8th grade teachers, education scholars, and school administrators from around the country. On April 12th, they published a revealing report titled Tying Shoes, Opening Bottles. Pandemic Kids Lack Basic Life Skills. This news report made two important points. First, basically, teachers were surprised by the numbers of students missing key skills. As Christine Jarbeau, a first grade teacher, put it, you'd say, okay, can you show me how to tie your shoes? And most of them would just kind of look at me, like really confused. They really weren't sure even where to start. In contrast, prior to the pandemic, Ms. Jarbeau would usually find that half the students entered first grade knowing how to tie their shoes. Tying their shoes was only one of the missing skills teachers reported. They also reported that students showed a limited ability to sit still in class. They seemed to have no concept of lining up and not touching other nearby children. They seemed unable to engage the practice of taking turns when it came to playground equipment and other items around the class. And these situations, these limitations or lack of skills, led to lots of bickering on the playground. Jenna Spear is a teacher naturalist in New Hampshire, and she visits classrooms and provides natural science lessons. According to the article, she reported that early on, she was watching a second grade read aloud when children began crushing forward, competing to be closest to the book. Spear sat back, feeling sad. She said, normally, when you read a story in second grade, kids know to sit down so everyone can see the pictures. But you'd have kids standing in front, like right in front of everybody. It's a picture of chaos. Chaos in the classroom, chaos on the playground. How did this come to be? And more important, what does it tell us about the past and what the future could be? Sociologically speaking, children end up with diminished skills because their families are stressed and often isolated a great deal since March 2020. We've all been feeling this isolation to some degree, and families were part of that as well. What that means, of course, is that children also were isolated. Neighborhood children were less able to interact, and visits to family, that is to say visits to cousins, grandparents, aunts and uncles, diminished. For these youngsters, chances for informal social interaction disappeared at the very stage of life during which foundational social lessons are often learned. Certainly, families taught their children some things. Children were potty trained, for example. But a lot of life skills are picked up in informal interaction, often with similar age peers. That's the socialization that was diminished. At the same time that we realized that families had these difficulties and that children were affected by it, we learned something about schools. But to extract those lessons, we need to consider the second message of the Washington Post article, which concerns basically how did teachers respond to pandemic kids missing skills? To begin to address that question, consider Christine Jarbeau again. This is the teacher that was faced with a room full of children unable to tie their shoes. What did she do? She decided to host a weekly shoe tying competition. She provided laces to students with Velcro or slip-on shoes. She gave each student a small hourglass sand timer. And week by week, they got lots of practice and lots of fun competition, learning how and practicing tying their shoes. Her approach was effective. After about 2 months, 17 of the 20 students in her class could tie and untie their shoes. Ms. Jarbeau was one of dozens of, perhaps hundreds of resourceful teachers, and the article talked about a few of them, teachers and administrators. So for example, Roma Groves Waters, a principal of Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary in Oakland Unified School District, wanted to reduce the bickering that students were engaged in. So what they did is they set up yoga and meditation sessions. They also taught 4th and 5th grade students to serve as safety leaders. To do that, they taught those students mediation principles so that they were then brought to help and used in the school to help resolve student conflicts, because often students respond better to those who are close in age. Or consider Sean O'Mara, an 8th grade social studies teacher at Keene Middle School in New Hampshire. This teacher noted that the new students of this year, the pandemic children, don't seem to know how to carry on a class discussion. So what this teacher did is took time out of class to explain how conversation works. Explained body language signals, what to think about when other students are talking, how to be civil while disagreeing, and more. At the beginning of the year, they would spend 20 minutes a day on these lessons. Now, the teacher reports, students seem to have got it. A brief reminder is all that's helpful. Or consider Amy Barker, a kindergarten teacher at Robert Morris School in Philadelphia. This teacher worked with Jessica Scherfs, a 5th grade teacher, to set up the Reading Buddy program. In this program, kindergarten students meet every Friday for 30 minutes, every Friday afternoon, to read one-on-one with a student from Jessica Scherfs' 5th grade class. This approach has been effective. Reading fluency improved for both sets of students, the kindergartners and the 5th graders, because one good way to learn is to try to teach it to someone else. And the kindergarten students would ask lots of questions. There were also social benefits as the students became friends, and that probably improved their feeling of belonging in the school. Teachers and on-site school administrators were very resourceful, and their resourcefulness is noteworthy. Sociologist Pierre Bourdieu once wrote, "By doing away with giving to everyone what it implicitly demands of everyone, the educational system demands of everyone alike that they have what it does not give." Before the pandemic, I am sure that some children arrived at school unable to tie their shoes, antsy when required to sit still and listen for what might seem like hours, uncomfortable with the regimentation of the queue. Often, such children were the subject of punishment or perhaps even ostracism. But many teachers and schools have responded differently to the pandemic kids. And in that response, in its success, we realize that teaching someone something they do not know is a more successful approach than is punishing them, stigmatizing them, or leaving them behind. What we learn is that we do not have to design our schools and pedagogies in an exclusionary way. We have the capacity to treat mismatched behavior and lack of knowledge as if they are amenable to matter-of-fact instruction. Bourdieu implies that if schools are going to require students to possess a skill or adopt an approach, schools might do a better job for society by patiently and explicitly instructing children in the skills they lack, so that they come to have the knowledge and skills they need to meet that requirement, be it tying shoes, taking turns, having a civil discussion, or something else. Now, one might ask, why didn't our schools work that way before the pandemic? A clue might be embedded in the comments one scholar provided in the news article. Frank Kell, a Yale professor of psychology, stated, quote, "Even affluent children coming from families in which dynamic back-and-forth conversations with peers and adults are the norm may need time to learn how to sit still and be more passive learners." Unquote. Reading between the lines, pandemic kids from poor families, middle-income families, and high-income families showed up to school insufficiently ready for school. Two facts are notable. One, both children of affluence and those without affluence lagged behind expectation. Two, schools did not stigmatize the deficits with which students entered school. Did the presence of affluent children among those with missing skills cause schools to be more nurturant in their response? Hard to say. But what we can say is that the missing skills of the pandemic kids, their encounter with the school, and teachers and schools' nurturant responses teach us that schools can actually work for every child. For that to happen going forward, administrators and parents need to support teachers as they unremarkably, matter-of-factly engage all students in line with one simple societal truth. Every child's need to learn is worth meeting. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.